I want you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is not something people like to admit, not even to themselves. At my age, most people expect you to soften your words, to be polite, to avoid uncomfortable truths. But I've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the truth only matters when it's uncomfortable. I'm 79 years old now, a retired school teacher, and there was a time not so long ago when I almost made a decision that would have quietly taken everything from me without anyone noticing. It would not have looked like a tragedy. It would have looked sensible, practical, even loving. But it would have erased me just the same. When I was young, I believed that family always knew what was best. I believed that when you grow older, you naturally lean on your children, and they guide you the rest of the way. That's what I saw growing up. That's what everyone said was right. And for most of my life, I never questioned it. I married young, raised 2 children, spent 34 years teaching history at the same school, and built a life that felt steady, predictable, and full. My husband, Daniel, was a quiet man, but dependable in a way that made everything feel anchored. We didn't have a perfect marriage, but we had a real one, the kind built on routine and shared years rather than grand gestures. After Daniel passed away, everything became quieter than I had ever imagined possible. Not just the house, but something inside me. People talk about grief like it's loud, like it's crying and breaking down, but for me, it was silence. A long, heavy silence that followed me from room to room. For the first few weeks, I moved through the house like a guest who didn't quite belong there anymore. I would wake up and reach for him, only to find an empty space that felt colder than it should have. I would cook too much food, forgetting it was just me now. Little habits that refused to disappear. That's when the phone call started. My daughter Mira called every morning before work. My son Arjun began visiting on weekends, sometimes without telling me in advance. At first, it felt comforting, like I wasn't completely alone in the world. They asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything. They told me they were worried about me being alone in such a big house. And slowly, without me realizing it, those conversations began to change. It started with small suggestions. Maybe you should think about moving closer to us. What if something happens and no one is there? You're not as young as you used to be. None of it sounded unreasonable. In fact, it sounded like concern, like love. And I wanted to believe that's what it was. But there was a part of me, a quiet part, that felt uneasy every time those words were spoken. Around that time, I began thinking more about my neighbor, Kamla. She had lived just 2 houses down from me for over 20 years. We weren't inseparable, but we had shared enough mornings, enough conversations over tea, to understand each other without needing many words. When her husband passed away, she was 74. I remember visiting her a few days after the funeral. She was sitting on her veranda, staring at the empty chair beside her, as if she expected him to walk back in at any moment. For a while, she managed on her own. She kept her routines, watered her plants, even continued her evening walks. But her son, who lived in another city, began calling more often. At first, she told me how grateful she was. "At least someone is thinking about me," she said once with a small smile. But over time, those calls began to carry a different tone, one filled with worry, urgency, and something else I couldn't quite name at the time. He would ask her what she would do if she fell. He would remind her that she was getting older, that living alone was risky. He told her it would be better, safer, more sensible if she came to live with him. And I watched slowly as Kamla began to repeat his words back to me. The same fears, the same concerns, as if they had become her own thoughts. One evening, during one of our walks, she told me she was thinking about moving. I stopped and looked at her, really looked at her. She was still strong, still steady on her feet, still sharper than most people half her age. I asked her if she truly wanted to go. She hesitated just for a moment before saying it was probably the right thing to do. That hesitation stayed with me. A few months later, she made the decision. She told me her son had insisted that it would give him peace of mind. She said the house felt too big now, too empty. I wanted to tell her that emptiness isn't something you fix by leaving, but I didn't. Sometimes people need to arrive at their own understanding, and I thought maybe I was wrong. I helped her pack. I watched as she folded years of her life into boxes, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Her books, her old photographs, the little things that made her house feel like hers. There wasn't room for everything, she said. There never is, I thought. The day she left, she hugged me a little longer than usual. She told me she would visit, that we would still talk, that nothing would really change. I nodded, even though something inside me knew it would. For the first few weeks, she called often. Her voice sounded bright, almost forced in its cheerfulness. She told me her son and his family were taking good care of her, that the grandchildren kept her busy, that she wasn't lonely anymore. It sounded like everything people say when they are trying to convince themselves they made the right choice. But there was something else in her voice, something quieter, harder to define. I couldn't name it then, but I could feel it. And as the weeks turned into months, that feeling only grew stronger. The calls became shorter, less frequent. And when she did speak, there was a heaviness in her words that hadn't been there before. I would ask her how her days were, and she would give simple answers, nothing detailed, nothing like the stories she used to share. One afternoon, she mentioned she had started helping with the grandchildren after school. Just to keep busy, she said. I didn't think much of it at the time. It sounded normal, even healthy. But then came another call where she mentioned cooking dinner most nights. Then another where she said she had taken over grocery shopping because her son was too busy. It was happening slowly, so slowly that it didn't seem like anything had changed. But everything had. I remember sitting in my living room after one of those calls, holding the phone in my hand long after the line had gone silent. There was a feeling in my chest I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. A quiet realization that what looked like care on the surface might be something else entirely. And for the first time, I began to wonder if the life everyone was encouraging me to choose was not the safe, loving solution they believed it to be, but something far more complicated, something that came at a cost no one was willing to talk about. The next time she called me, I could hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it anymore. Something in her had shifted, not suddenly, but in a way that felt like a slow fading. Her voice, once steady and warm, now sounded careful, almost as if she was choosing each word so that it wouldn't cause trouble. I asked her what her days were like, not casually this time, but with intention, and there was a pause on the other end that lasted longer than it should have. She told me she woke up early, before anyone else in the house. At first, she said it was out of habit, but then she admitted it was because there was too much to do once the day started. She would prepare breakfast for the family, something simple at first, but over time it became expected. Her son left early for work, her daughter-in-law not long after, and by then Kamla had already begun her day. She would get the children ready, make sure their uniforms were clean, their bags packed, their lunches prepared. Then she would walk them to the bus stop and come back to a house that, for a brief moment, was quiet again. But that quiet didn't belong to her anymore. It wasn't the kind of silence she used to have, the kind where she could sit with a cup of tea and read a few pages of a book or look out at her plants. This silence came with a list. Things that needed to be done before everyone returned. Cleaning, laundry, tidying up spaces that were never truly hers. She told me she didn't mind helping, that it made her feel useful, but there was something in the way she said it that made me uneasy. I asked her if she rested during the day. Another pause. She said sometimes, but then quickly added that there was always something else to take care of. Groceries to buy, meals to prepare, small errands that somehow became her responsibility without anyone ever clearly assigning them to her. It had just happened, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As she spoke, I could picture her standing in a kitchen that wasn't hers, moving carefully so as not to disrupt anyone else's routine. I could imagine her holding onto the edges of a life that no longer fully belonged to her. And what troubled me most was not the work itself, but the way it had become invisible, unspoken, expected. A few weeks later, she told me she had tried to talk to her son about it. She said she felt tired, more tired than she expected to be at this stage in her life. She didn't ask for much, just suggested that maybe they could share some of the responsibilities, that perhaps she could have a little time for herself. The way she described his reaction stayed with me. He hadn't shouted or argued. He had simply looked confused, almost hurt, and asked her if she wasn't comfortable, if she didn't have everything she needed. Everything she needed. A room, food, safety. On paper, it sounded like care. But what about the things that don't appear on paper? What about space, identity, the quiet right to exist without being needed every moment of the day? She told me she didn't bring it up again after that. It was easier to stay silent than to feel like she was asking for too much. That was the moment I understood something I had never truly seen before. You don't always need to be told what your role is. Sometimes it is shaped around you so gently that by the time you realize it, you are already living inside it. The next time I saw my daughter, she brought it up again. The same concern, the same careful tone. She said she worried about me living alone, that it wasn't safe, that I shouldn't have to manage everything by myself. She said I could come stay with her, that it would be better for everyone. She spoke with love, I don't doubt that. But as she spoke, I found myself thinking about Canla standing at that kitchen counter, too tired to sit down. I asked my daughter what my days would look like if I moved in. She laughed lightly and said I wouldn't have to do anything, that I could just relax. But I've lived long enough to know that life is never that simple. People don't always ask. Sometimes they just adjust, and before you know it, you adjust with them. I didn't give her an answer that day. A month passed, and Kamla's calls became even less frequent. When she did call, she sounded distant, as if part of her attention was always somewhere else. I could hear voices in the background, children calling for her, someone asking where something was. She would apologize, say she had to go, that she would call later, but later rarely came. Then one morning, she called at an unusual time, very early, before the day had fully begun. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She told me she didn't feel like herself anymore. Not in a dramatic way, not with tears or anger, just a quiet statement that carried more weight than anything else she had said. She said she felt like she had become a role rather than a person. Someone who existed to keep things running smoothly. Someone who filled the gaps in other people's lives. I tried to remind her of who she was, of the woman who used to sit with me for hours talking about books and memories and plans, but she stopped me gently. "There's no space for that here," she said. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. I began to notice how often this pattern repeated itself, not just with her, but with others I knew. Women who had lived full, independent lives suddenly becoming smaller within months of moving in with their children. Not because their children were cruel, but because the structure of that life left no room for who they used to be. I remember one afternoon sitting by my window, watching the street outside, and thinking about the choices we make when we are afraid. Fear can be very convincing. It can dress itself up as logic, as practicality, as love. It can make you believe that giving something up is the safest thing to do. But safety is a complicated thing. It's not just about avoiding danger. It's about preserving something inside you that cannot be replaced once it's gone. The day everything changed came without warning. I received a call, not from Kamla, but from her son. His voice was controlled, but there was tension beneath it. He told me she had fainted that morning while preparing breakfast. The doctors said it was exhaustion, that she needed rest. Exhaustion. The word felt too small for what I knew was happening. I asked if I could speak to her, but he said she was sleeping. I spent the rest of that day unable to focus on anything else. My mind kept returning to the image of her moving through each day without pause, without space, until her body simply gave in. A few days later, she called me herself. Her voice was weaker than I had ever heard it, but there was something else there too, something I hadn't heard in months. Clarity. She told me she wanted to come back. Not to visit, not for a short stay, but to return to her own home. I didn't hesitate. I told her to come back as soon as she could, that everything else could be figured out later. There was a long silence before she spoke again. She said her son didn't think it was a good idea. He said she wasn't well enough to live alone, that she needed someone to take care of her. I asked her what she wanted, not what he thought, not what seemed sensible, but what she truly wanted. Her answer was quiet, but it carried a strength I hadn't heard in a long time. She said she would rather struggle in her own space than slowly disappear in someone else's. That was the moment everything became clear to me, because I realized that what she was choosing was not difficulty over comfort or loneliness over company. She was choosing herself. And I knew then that if I ever stood at the same crossroads, I would have to make the same choice, no matter how difficult it seemed, because some things, once lost, cannot be given back. 3 days later, I went to pick her up myself. She didn't tell me all the details of how she convinced them, or maybe she didn't have the strength to argue anymore. Sometimes, when a person reaches their limit, they stop explaining and simply act. I was standing at the small bus stop just outside our neighborhood when she arrived, holding a single worn suitcase and a smaller bag in her hand. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. It wasn't just that she had lost weight, though she had. It wasn't just the deep lines in her face that seemed to have appeared too quickly. It was something in her posture, the way she stood as if she had been carrying something heavy for far too long. But when she saw me, truly saw me, there was a flicker of something familiar in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or the quiet recognition of being seen again. We didn't say much on the drive back. Some silences don't need to be filled. When we reached her house, she stepped out slowly, almost hesitantly, like someone returning to a place they weren't sure would still belong to them. The gate creaked the same way it always had. The front door still had that small scratch near the handle from years ago. So many things were unchanged, and yet everything felt different. Inside, the house was emptier than before. Her son had already sold some of the furniture, thinking she wouldn't need it anymore. There were fewer chairs, fewer pieces of the life she had built over decades. But the walls were still there. The windows still opened to the same street. The air, though stale, felt like hers again. She walked through each room slowly, her fingers brushing against the walls, the edges of the table, the window frames. It was as if she was reintroducing herself to her own life. At one point, she stopped in the middle of the living room and just stood there, eyes closed, breathing deeply. When she opened them again, there were tears, but they didn't look like the kind that come from sadness. They looked like release. The first few weeks were not easy. Independence, once lost, doesn't return overnight. There were moments when she doubted herself, moments when the quiet felt too heavy, when she wondered if she had made a mistake. She told me once that it would have been easier to stay, to follow the path that everyone else believed was right. Easier, but not better. She began slowly, rebuilding her life piece by piece. She bought a second-hand chair and placed it near the window where she used to sit. She cleaned the kitchen, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She started cooking for herself again, simple meals at first, then more as her strength returned. Each small act was a step back toward something she had almost lost completely. The day she stepped back into her garden was the day I knew she would be all right. It had been neglected, the plants overgrown, the soil dry and forgotten. But she knelt down anyway, her hands pressing into the earth as if greeting an old friend. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her face. This was where she belonged. She planted new flowers that season. Not the same ones as before, not exactly, but close enough to remind her of what had been there. Every morning, she would step outside, water them, check on them, spend a few quiet moments simply being present. It wasn't just about the plants. It was about reclaiming a space that responded only to her. Over the months that followed, I watched her come back to life in a way that is difficult to describe. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden transformations, no grand moments of change. It was gradual, steady, like a light returning after a long dimming. Her voice grew stronger again. Her laughter returned, not as loud as before, but real. She began calling me more often, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to talk. We resumed our walks, slowly at first, shorter distances, but enough to bring back a rhythm we both missed. There were days when she still felt tired, days when the weight of what she had been through lingered. But those days were hers. That made all the difference. Her son visited once, months later. The conversation was polite, careful, but there was a tension beneath it that neither of them fully addressed. After he left, she sat quietly for a long time. I didn't ask her what she was thinking. Some things are too complicated to put into words. Eventually, she spoke. She said he believed she had rejected him, that she didn't trust him to take care of her. I asked her if that was true. She shook her head gently. I didn't reject him, she said. I rejected losing myself. That distinction stayed with me. She lived in that house for several more years, on her own terms. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but with a sense of ownership over her life that no one else could define for her. When she grew older and her body slowed down, she adjusted, not by giving up her independence, but by reshaping it. She accepted help when she needed it, but she chose it. That was the difference. When she passed away, it was in her own bed, in her own home, surrounded by the quiet familiarity she had fought to return to. There was no rush, no confusion, no sense of being out of place. Just a life that had come to its natural end, without being cut short by something unseen. At her funeral, her son spoke about how much he had wanted to take care of her, how he never understood why she insisted on living alone. I stood there listening, and for a moment, I almost said something. I almost told him that care is not just about providing a place to stay or meals to eat. It is about allowing a person to remain who they are, even as they grow older. But I didn't say it. Some lessons cannot be given. They have to be realized. After my husband passed, my children began to ask me the same questions. They used the same words, the same concerns. They wanted me to move in with them, to be safe, to be looked after. And I understood their intention. I truly did. But I also remembered everything I had seen. I remembered Canla standing in a kitchen that wasn't hers, too tired to sit. I remembered the way her voice had changed, the way her world had slowly shrunk until there was almost nothing left of it. And I remembered the strength it took for her to come back. So I said no. It wasn't an easy decision. My daughter cried. My son looked at me with a kind of quiet disappointment that stayed with me for days. They thought I was being stubborn, maybe even ungrateful, but I wasn't rejecting them. I was protecting something they couldn't fully see. I have lived alone for years now. There are days when the house feels too quiet, when the absence of another voice is more noticeable than I would like. There are moments of loneliness, moments of doubt. But there is also something else, something that cannot exist without that solitude. Freedom. I wake up when I want. I eat when I feel hungry. I spend my days in ways that make sense to me, not to someone else. If I feel tired, I rest. If I feel restless, I step outside and walk, even if it's just to the end of the street and back. These may seem like small things, but they are not small when they belong entirely to you. I have learned that there is a difference between being safe and being alive. Safety can sometimes come at the cost of everything that makes life meaningful. It can become a quiet exchange, one where you trade your independence for comfort, your identity for convenience. And sometimes, without realizing it, you give away more than you intended. What I learned from watching her was simple, but not easy to accept. Care that takes away your sense of self is not care. It may look like it from the outside. It may even feel like it in the beginning, but over time, it changes into something else. Something that slowly reshapes you until you no longer recognize who you are. I chose not to let that happen to me. This house, small and quiet as it is, holds my life exactly as I want it. Every corner, every routine, every moment belongs to me. It may not be perfect, but it is mine. And at this stage in life, that matters more than anything else. If there is one thing I would say to anyone standing where I once stood, it is this. Do not give up yourself in exchange for comfort. Do not confuse being needed with being valued. And do not believe that growing older means you have to become smaller. You are still you. That does not change unless you allow it to. And whatever time you have left, however much or however little, make sure it remains yours.